Combat, a staple in any game that's ever existed. Here's what it looks like in mine. Well, it could be improved. This is a game about crushing a large procedurally generated, explorable open world into a small mobile device. And there has to be obstacles while traversing that world, like combat encounters. I want to have as much variety as I can possibly fit into a small package. And as someone who knows a lot about small packages, do you know what I also love? Weapons. The more equipables in this game, the better. There's going to be big ones, small ones, and scary looking ones. I want the player to be able to deck themselves out in the fanciest perforators since voxel games were invented. And you'll be able to find all of these things while exploring the world, hopefully. Let's spend this week improving combat as much as humanly possible, with more equipable weapons, better character animations, and more ferocious enemies. Engage transition to Trello board. Hey, that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, there's still a ton of stuff in doing. I'm going to need to define a bit better how the different weapons actually work. So when the player goes to attack an enemy, they're going to perform a different animation depending on the type of item they actually have equipped. So say for instance they have a bow and arrow equipped, well that's obviously going to be a different animation compared to if they had to just a sword equipped. Improve definition of attacks. I think I want to leave the door open for all sorts of variety because that is what's going to make the items actually interesting. Now, one thing I've been thinking about is that I'd like to try and make the equipable entities as generic as possible. So what I mean by that is it's not a case of only the player can equip these items. I think it would be quite interesting if a mob could equip an item and complete the sort of animation and procedure of performing the attack in the exact same way as the player. Originally I was thinking that when I had different types of enemies it would be like, you know, bow and arrow goblin and sword goblin and axe wielding goblin and all that sort of thing. It was never just going to be like you have the goblin enemy and then it holds different items depending on which, and then obviously its AI would change depending on which item it has. You know, if it has a bow and arrow it might not want to get too close to the player. So what that does mean is that I'll have to make sure that the enemy characters actually have proper limbs. Finally, I think I need to improve the enemy AI a little bit so that they actually perform the attacks in a sensible way, compared to what they're doing currently where they just move up to the player, like move up to the exact point where the player is, not just close to it, and spam hitboxes. So instead they need to actually kind of walk up, animate, and it has to kind of look sensible. So I'm not going to add too many things because we do still have those issues left over from the previous week, and I do actually want to finish them. I think the final task this week will be just add a few different items to see the system in full effect. Regular sword, two-handed sword. So two-handed sword would kind of be held like that, and it would probably have some system where you couldn't have some other sword in your other hand. Dagger. So when you have the dagger, you just kind of, you know, go a bit like that. Shanky shanky. Right, before I make any more controversial comments, let's begin development. Oh, what's that? Is that time for progress update? So the main thing is I've cleaned up the goblin animation a bit. So it's not just a sort of ruined version of the player animation, it's its own thing now. So he looks kind of cute actually. I like the way he looks. Again, the art style lends itself quite well towards just making animations because they're easy to make as a result of the fact that, you know, arms and legs are blobs and just rotate around the character. So let's have a look at him in the inspector. The hands are slightly smaller than the player hands just because it made it look a bit better, but the system to equip items still works the same because it essentially just scales the item relative to the bit of the monster. So yeah, it's good. The thing is I'm spending most of my time just building systems at the moment. It's not really just I spent a whole day doing that animation in particular. I spent the day building a system that would allow me to make more of these things in future. So I think the next plan is going to be I need to actually have a stabbing animation because I don't have one of those at the moment. So I need to do a bit of, well, so yeah, we need a bit of a stabbing animation. So let's get on that. Stabby stabby. Right, so I began adding the animation for the stabbing and essentially went down a massive rabbit hole of improving my character inspector tool. I know I made the decision a little while ago that I would do all the animations by hand rather than using Blender. Now, in the case of the player walking, you know, the feet walking animation or whatever, that's probably acceptable, but I'm beginning to realize that in some other cases when you actually need to do like a, you know, this sort of motion, it's kind of difficult. So anyway, I've improved the character inspector tool, so let's have a look at that. Oh my god, look how different it is. So yeah, I've got a fancy grid at the floor to tell you where the origin is. So a lot of it still works the same as before. This is a bit old, so I'm going to change this to something else. But you can see my sword swing animation. Now I've also got a system where you can assign equipables. We did a sword in the right hand. There we go, that's a sword animation. But what's interesting about this is that we can now equip multiple items at once. Ooh, look at that. Yeah, so there are some things that maybe don't work properly, like you can equip the health potions. But I still think that looks cool, like maybe there'll be some gameplay use for that at some point. Maybe I could have like an equipable item as potions that you can throw. The other thing I can do is I can switch between the model types I've made. So here we have a goblin. So you can see that the system scales as it's expected to. I have essentially just defined another entity type through quite a simple mechanism actually. This is essentially how you do it. So you just create a series of nodes and tell them what they are. So in this case you're saying this is the equip node for the left and right hand. And you can see this applies just to different entities accordingly. So the interesting thing about the goblin is that they don't actually have a head, they just have the body because the head is part of the body. So that means that where the player has a head, the goblins don't have a head. But the system works because the feet animation can still be applied to the goblin even though it doesn't have a head, because it's been built in a way where you're essentially just defining which bits do what. So you see here player head is type head. I could change this to body and the system would still work. So I've separated the animations off into this base animation class. So it's essentially just way simpler. It only defines the nodes it actually needs. Before I was just passing them all over and some were just not being animated by the animation. So this feet walk animation can be applied to anything. All the animation is doing is saying that node which is this one move at this and node which is that one move at this. And then from that, when the code comes to just construct the character, it knows based on the nodes what it needs to do in order to animate that thing. So it essentially just queries the object type and finds it. So I've got this class where I just define all the different animations. Of course they're based off the engine's animation system, but I did need a bit of extra metadata. So this is a case of where it's like legs walk, arms walk, and then I've also got my sword swing as well. And you can see it has to define that I need a left foot and a right foot. So I think it's quite a good system really. I mean, my intention for everything is that it has to scale well. So it has to scale well in a way that, say I have to add another item, all I have to do is go into my items definitions where they all live and just apply all the relevant values. So systems are important. That was kind of funny. Anyway, so I've got no idea what I'm going to do next, as I just ended up going down a rabbit hole with this, so maybe I'll just ignore it for now. But you'll find out right now. Welcome back. I have a few various interesting combat items to show you. So I've now got a two-handed sword. Hey, look at that. That requires two hands. I've also got an animation to go along with it, which I'm pretty pleased with, so let's have a look at that. That looks so lovely. This was all done by hand. This was not done in Blender, and it still looks okay. So yes, that's all quite nice, and I can get the goblin to do the exact same thing. So he can hold the sword, and he can also do the animation. It all fits quite nicely, really. The other thing is I've also got a shield. It looks fine. Nothing special, but it is called Simple Shield, so it's to be expected. So personally, I think everything's kind of coming together quite nicely. So the advantage of this system is it's quite easy to add variations to the entity in a way that I would have had to do a lot of legwork before. So you can see in this example here, some of the goblins have shields and some of them don't. So this is really just done with a random integer, and you just say, hey, equip the shield. So I'm sure the moment you've all been waiting for is to watch me walk up to an enemy and destroy it with my magical sword. Hey, look at that! He's actually doing it! Don't pay attention to this one here. Yeah, so obviously it's going quite slowly. I nerfed the weapon a bit just so you can actually see the animation playing out. So there are still some bugs. My targeting system needs to be improved because the player thinks he's attacking something when he isn't. But it wouldn't be an Other Mythos game devlog without something being broken by the end of the week. So the way that I'm doing a lot of these things, so you can see the animation information for the regular sword and then also the information for the two-handed sword. So they define how long the attack actually takes to play out. And this does have to match with the animation provided in Equipable. And then from that, it really just plays out like this. So you say, a lot of this is boilerplate, so it just starts and stops the appropriate animation. But this is really the interesting bit, because this is a bit where you actually spawn the damage sender, which is what deals with damage. So I do have plans to change this in future. Right now, it's essentially just spawning a projectile into the world. And that's not really what I want, because that will send damage to every entity. So there's a difference between moves and attacks, and attacks don't necessarily send damage to every entity. Really, there's all sorts of things you could do in here, like you could spawn other entities, you could spawn sound effects, particles, projectiles. That's why I've broken it down into a function like this. I'd also like to point out that I spent a lot of time today designing this sort of targeting system. Previously it was just really bodged in the way that the player walked up to the enemy and actually attacked them. So that is a bit of the way through. But it did take longer than I thought it would to get this through, so it's a work in progress, unfortunately. So it's currently quite late on Saturday. Now, I do have a video to edit, but assuming things go well, I might be able to get the dagger item done. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but you'll be able to see in the video. So if that doesn't happen, then I'll just have to do a public apology and do that next week. But in case I don't get that done, thank you for watching this week's installment of This Game Devlog that still doesn't have a name. I'll give it a name eventually. I don't really know what else to say. I know I normally bang my head on the desk. Maybe I'll just bang my head on the microphone instead. So, see ya. Oh, that kind of hurt actually.